Welcome to the AI4EU Café today on May 31st, 2021. I present to you today our great speaker, Bernd, Carsten, Stahl. As you see, he is here. Hello, Bernd. He is Professor of Critical Research in Technology and Director of the Center for Computing and Social Responsibility at the Montfort University, Leicester, UK. Leicester or Leicester?
Leicester.
Leicester, UK. With his talk on AI, ethics, and human rights, designing a better world. My name is Carmen Williams. I'm the moderator and organizer of this cafe. I'm the director of the company Grassroots Arts and partner in the European AI4EU project. Always in the beginning, shortly the regulations here. Please take notice that the session will be recorded. No confidential information shall be shared in this cafe session. In this cafe, the speaker expresses his personal view and opinion. This is not necessarily the official AI4EU project opinion. And what's this cafe about? The cafe is an online forum to gain insight into the European AI scene. Participants get the chance to share knowledge and experiences. And as always, this is an interactive session. Please send us your questions you have to the presenter, to the speaker. He will be, I think, happy to answer them. So please, on the right side, you find a control panel, and there's a text field, and you can write your questions in there and send it to us. So now we're coming to the main highlight of today. I introduce Bernd. Bernd Carsten Stahl is Professor of Critical Research in Technology and Director of the Center for Computing and Social Responsibility at the Montfort University.
Leicester,
UK. His interests cover philosophical issues arising from the intersections of business, technology, and information. This includes ethical questions of current and emerging of ICT's critical approaches to information systems and issues related to responsible research and innovation. He serves as ethics director of the EU flagship Human Brain Project. He is coordinator of the EU project Shaping the Ethical Dimensions of Information Technologies, a European Perspective. So it's called SHERPA in short, and is co-PI of the Observatory for Responsible Research and Innovation in ICT. This is impressive, and I'm very happy you join us. Thank you for coming here. And I will now hand you over the presentation role, and I'm very happy to listen to you today. So yes, I gave you the presenter role.
Okay, thank you very much, Carmen. Can you see my presentation? All
yes.
Well? Okay, so thank you, Carmen, and of course, thank you to the project, the AI4EU project, for inviting me here and giving me the opportunity to give a presentation. What I will be talking about is really a summary of the key insights of the SHERPA project. So SHERPA is an EU project, as Carmen has just indicated. It's been running for 3 years, and we have another 6 months to go. And I'll say a little bit more about what we've done in a moment. You see here on the starting screen the link to the project. So if you're interested, pretty much everything I'm talking about will be somewhere on that website. If you're interested in the ethical and human rights aspects of AI, I hope and I would invite you to make use of that website. Before I talk about the content of the project, let me quickly give an introduction to where I come from and what I do. So from Carmen, we know that not everybody knows where Leicester is. So you see Leicester here is at the tip of this arrow on the map on the left-hand side. It's in the middle of England. It's in a place called the East Midlands, and it's one of the, well, it's about 100 miles north of London. In Leicester, we have a university called the Montfort University, and in there we have a research group called the Center for Computing and Social Responsibility, which I have the honor of being the director of. So this center has been around for more than 25 years at this point, and we've been looking at ethical and social aspects of computing for a quarter of a century, so well before AI and ethics became a hype. We are reasonably big. We have about 25 members of staff, teaching, research, and mixed. We have been organizing one of the key conference series in ethics and computing, the Ethicom one. We run a couple of journals. So I'm the editor of the latter one, of the Journal of Responsible Technology. And we have a ton of projects, and I'm going to talk about one of them today. So the SHERPA project started about 3 years ago. And the way we've organized it is along a set of challenges. So SHERPA doesn't use or didn't use the term AI in the original application. So we talked about smart information systems. The idea here is that these are systems that draw on AI technologies, they draw on big data analytics, but they also look at the broader socio-technical system. That's why we use this term SIS, Smart Information Systems, but the discourse has sort of passed us by, and now AI is very prominent, so I will mostly use the term AI as we go on. So what did we do, or what are the challenges? The first challenge we faced was the question of what actually are the ethical and human rights issues that these systems raise in social reality, in practice. And in order to find out what those are, we did a set of 10 case studies. We wrote 5 future-oriented scenarios. We looked at particular technical threats, cyber threats, and we did a literature review of both the ethical and philosophical side of things, and the legal and in particular the human rights side of these technologies. Now we realized that we are not the only ones in this space, and therefore we did a number of stakeholder-related issues. But quickly, let me run you through the case studies and the scenarios we've done. So in those case studies, we try to cover a broad range of application areas of smart information systems. And I'll just give you the titles and the main topics of them. So we looked at government, agriculture, science, sustainability in smart cities and Internet of Things. We looked at insurance, energies, communication, manufacturing, and trade. If you're interested, all of these are available on our website. For all of those 10 case studies, we wrote a separate document, the idea being to look at what are the issues that people encounter in practice and how do they deal with them. In addition to those case studies that looked at currently existing technologies, we also wrote a set of scenarios where we try to look a bit in the future to look at things that are around the corner, that are already there to some degree, but which we expect to be much more relevant and much more prominent in future. Things like predictive policing, the future of warfare, mimicking technologies, so deepfakes, the use of AI in education, and autonomous vehicles. So we realized that we are not the only ones in this space, so therefore we needed to make sure that we have a broad range of stakeholders engaged, and for that purpose we had a stakeholder board, or we still have a stakeholder board. We did a bunch of interviews, we did an online survey and a Delphi study, all of which were meant to broaden the range of insights that we have. Now, having come to an understanding of what the ethical issues are, and I'll come back to what I actually think they are, we also thought about what are ways of dealing with them, what are ways of addressing them, and we explored some of the options in a bit more detail. So we looked at providing guidance for researchers and users of smart information systems in practice. We looked at the landscape of regulatory options. We looked at standardization potential. We looked at technical options, in particular with regards to the cybersecurity side of things. And we also wrote the terms of reference for a potential regulator for AI. In order to then test whether any of these solutions work and how they sit in the context of the broader debate, we did a set of focus groups to test and validate possible solutions. And then finally, we had the challenge of implementing, of making our voice heard. So we did some of the things that any EU project does, such as dissemination, communication, and so on. But I think there are 2 things that set the SHERPA project apart from many other projects. One is the artistic representation. So in addition to 10 short videos that we produced for a variety of topics across the project, we also had an artist in residence who, if you look at our website, you'll find has done lots of interesting things in smart home environment, with smart weapons and so on. to showcase how these technologies may play out. And finally, we have an advocacy arm where the idea is that we will take the outcomes of the project, the finding of the project, and then try to bring them to decision makers to make sure that they actually have an impact. And today's presentation, from my perspective, is part of this advocacy and outreach activity. Right, so that was the SHERPA background. And what I will talk about today is really a high-level overview of some of the key findings. And I use those to justify our recommendations. So I'll come back to what we think should happen and why it should happen. So looking at the literature, but also the practice of AI, we distinguish three different purposes for the use of AI. So why do people use AI? I think there are three main groups that you can distinguish. One of them, and that's the most prominent one, is AI makes things easier, it's more efficient, it can help you optimize, and in the end, in a corporate environment, that means it leads to more profits. You can also find examples of AI used for social control. So the Chinese social credit scoring is probably the most prominent example of that. But there are others. Zuboff's surveillance capitalism goes very strongly in that direction. The idea being that technology is used in order to control people, to make sure that they do what they're supposed to do. And finally, and this is where we put this concept of ethics and human rights. The idea is that AI can be used to promote human flourishing. And human flourishing in the sense of allowing people to achieve the state that they would like to achieve. Now, when you look at these three purposes, they are not necessarily contradictory, and that's why they're in an overlapping Venn diagram. So it may well be that social control is required for human flourishing. In the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, we all realize that on occasion people need to be controlled in order to allow them to stay healthy. Similarly, efficiency and profit maximization is not necessarily a bad thing. It may actually be required to produce the wealth to allow people to flourish. So I'm not saying these things are contradictory, but what I'm saying is that there are different focuses that people can pursue. And we would argue in the SHERPA project that human flourishing is the way, or is the purpose that should be pursued in order to ensure high ethical standards. So what is AI? There are tons and tons of definitions out here. One is, the first one is from the European White Paper, which has now led to the regulation, which is a very broad one, a combination of technologies that combine data, algorithms, and computing. And then the second one is a more academic one from one of many textbooks around what are the mental activities that AI technologies try to replicate, such as memory, emotion, perception, and so on. Now, the academic publisher Elsevier has produced an overview of AI about 3 years ago now, where they looked at the academic, at different types of literature to find out what people talk about when they use the term AI. And what you see here, this diagram is an attempt to group and map a set of, I think they came up with 800 or so keywords in the end, all of which refer to AI. And they try to cluster them and try to see what is the shared core that they all have. And it turns out that there was no one shared core. There are 5 or 6 or 7 different main clusters, and those are, the most prominent one at the moment is machine learning, but there are also computer vision, there is fuzzy logic. So it's not just all about machine learning. And interestingly, there's nothing that they all have completely in common. So if you will, this is more a question of family resemblance rather than a clear individual definition. Now that raises problems when you think about the ethics of AI, because if it's difficult to define what AI is, how do you know what ethical issues might be? So from the work that we've done in SHERPA, we've come up with a categorization of concepts of AI, which maps to what we believe are the key strands of the ethics debate. So we would suggest that you can distinguish 3 different types of concepts of AI. On the one hand, you have the focus on currently very successful machine learning technologies, typically based on deep neural nets. This is sort of the core of the current technical development. But secondly, you also have references to AI which take this type of technology and looks more at the socio-technical system which it's used or played out. So those are the socio-technical systems. Might be a financial institution where AI is used for credit scoring, or it might be autonomous vehicles, where you have the core of AI, which sit in a much broader context. And then finally, there is general AI or artificial general intelligence or good old-fashioned intelligence or whatever you want to call it. So these are technologies that are truly human-like in their capacities. So they don't exist. There is no such thing as it, but it is a use of the term which is quite prominent and which has a lot of resonance in the ethics discourse. So each of these uses of the concept of AI has different characteristics, and these characteristics then later on translate into some of the ethical issues that they raise. So on the one hand, machine learning, as we know it now, is well known for being opaque. It's unpredictable because the systems and the models change over time and requires large amounts of data to train the models and validate them. The socio-technical systems are characterized by their perceived high level of social impact. They can manipulate human beings, they can shape the space that we perceive to be open to us, and they are seen to be autonomous, so that means that they act without necessarily being individually steered by an individual human. And then general AI raises all sorts of questions around nature of humanity, the nature of intelligence. What does it mean to be intelligent? What does it mean to be real? How can we know about reality? So some very deep philosophical questions. Now, if we take these three groups of concepts of AI, we can then map them to the ethics discourse. So on the one hand, there are specific issues that arise from the current state of machine learning. Then we have more general questions about living in a digital world, which relate to those socio-technical systems. And then we have what I would call metaphysical questions or philosophical questions, or whatever you may want to call them. So those specific issues of machine learning are things like bias, discrimination coming from bias in data sets. There are questions around security of systems, there are questions around data protection, and so on. So these are very specific, highly prominent, well-researched, well-addressed questions. Not resolved, but certainly very prominent. The ethics of AI arising from general questions about the digital world are things like autonomy, both autonomies of human beings, but also the autonomy of systems themselves. There are questions of power distribution, economic power, political power. So again, Zuboff's surveillance capitalism fits straight in here. Questions around the future of warfare, autonomous weaponry, distribution of benefits, risk and benefits, who gets the risk, who benefits from the systems. So the big political questions around justice in here. And then metaphysical questions have an ethical component to them when we look at the possibility of things like the singularity, superintelligence, and maybe more immediate questions around how do these new technologies change the way we see ourselves, how do they change our view of human nature. So for some of these issues, we have technical, legal, or other remedies which are either being developed or already being deployed. So data protection now is in the EU certainly well established. There's a lot of emphasis on security, and there's a huge amount of research currently at explainability of AI and so on. Then for the socio-technical systems, these are really questions that are much more on a political level. So they are call for policies, they're call for things like taxation, liability legislation, AI regulation, if you will. And then we have those big questions, which are really philosophical questions and maybe perpetual. Right. So this is sort of the overview of the ethical issues of AI as we've encountered it in the SHERPA project. We also looked at what can be done, what should be done, what is proposed to be done about them. So these mitigation measures can also be categorized, and we suggest 4 different categories. So there are policy and regulatory options, there are organizational options, there are technical solutions, and there are solutions that aim at the individual. So on the policy and regulatory front, we have on the one hand specific regulation for AI, and the EU proposal for a regulation that came out, a month ago now, is a primary example of that. But there's also a lot of other legislation and regulation already out there which may be relevant, including human rights law, competition law, suggestions for a new regulator, and I'll come back to a regulator later on. So that's on the policy level, that's on the high level of society. Companies and other organizations also have a role to play, and they have various mechanisms that they can use to address current issues around AI, from risk management to impact assessments, quality assurance, corporate social responsibility, and many other processes which already exist or can be tailored to be relevant to AI. There are a number of technical measures, certainly with regards to security. There's a lot of work being done, and some of this is relevant to data protection as well. There's much work on the standardization level. On the one hand, you're probably all aware of the IEEE family of standards around autonomous systems, but there's a lot more work in the standards world currently being undertaken to not just standardize AI, but also look at how ethical aspects of AI need to inform standards development. And then there are guidelines, for example, for ethics by design, value sensitive design. So that's the technical level. And then finally, there are mechanisms to support individuals who are working in the space, for example, through a variety of ethical frameworks, through professional bodies, through tailored methodologies that help developers, for example, to ensure that ethical concerns are addressed. So we had a bunch of issues, we have a bunch of mitigation measures, and then finally, my last bunch of things here is the stakeholders. So the individuals or group who are involved in this, and I've carved them up into 3 groups here. You could carve them up differently if you prefer. So I would distinguish between policy level stakeholders, organizations, and individuals. And on the policy level, you have anything from international bodies like the EU, UNESCO, UN, to national policymakers, to research funders, ethics bodies, and so on. Organizations, you have very important role for the organizations that produce, develop, deploy AI. But you also have a lot of other organizations that sit in this ecosystem, such as media, educators, standardization bodies, and so on. And then finally, you have individuals who, of course, make up many of these stakeholders, but who also have a role to play individually. They may be experts, they may be the developers, they may be users, they may be activists of some sort, but I think very importantly, it may also be non-users. So people who do not have an interest and don't want to use AI, but who will still be affected by the way it is being used. So where does that lead us? It leads us at the point where this landscape is immensely complex. And it's not just complex in the sense that there are lots of different components coming together, but there is sort of an epistemic complexity. So just getting to grips with what it is we're talking about, what the issues are, how they're being perceived by different groups is non-trivial. In effect, there's a distribution of responsibility. Many different groups and individuals have different types of responsibilities. And at the same time, we are witnessing continuing technical progress. So the technology that's available changes, which means that all the other parts of the equation also change. So the solution to the AI conundrum is certainly not a simple solution, but it will be an intelligent mix of various different things. And in order to say something relatively novel about this and make a contribution to this discourse, we have suggested to adopt this concept of ecosystem, which has been very prominent on the European level, but it's also been adopted in many other places, and try to look at, well, what would it mean for an AI ecosystem or a set of ecosystems to be conducive and support and promote human flourishing. So that's the question. So we are, what we're trying to do here is we are trying to make a set of proposals that would allow us to move towards an ecosystem of AI for human flourishing. How do we do that, and how would that work? Well, and I think I hope this is relatively novel and unique. So we've tried to take this concept or this metaphor of an ecosystem seriously and try to explore what would that mean in practice. What are the characteristics of ecosystems, and how do we need to consider those in order to make sure that this concept of flourishing may be promoted. So what are characteristics of ecosystems? Ecosystems have unclear boundaries. So what exactly is within the system and outside the system is not necessarily clear and obvious. They are open, they are permeable, so players can join an ecosystem, they can leave an ecosystem. They change over time. So evolution is seen as a key driver of change. And the literature that we've looked at in coming up with these arguments is very much the innovation ecosystem literature. And this is something that you find in the innovation studies field, which typically I would say is somewhere in the management literature. And one of the questions that people in innovation ecosystems ask is, well, why do we have change? Why do particular constellations change over time? And they have caught on to this concept of evolution, again, another biological metaphor to explain why things change. Evolution, however, does not necessarily always mean that there is competition. It can also be co-evolution. There can be mutual learning between members of ecosystems. So these members of the ecosystem stand in complex relationship. So they can evolve together, they can all perish together, and they are definitely interdependent. So the relationship between the actors is complex. So in such a system where there are no simple linear causal relationships, what needs to be done, what can be done in order to steer a system in a particular direction which is desired, in our case, towards human flourishing. So we're suggesting that there are three sets of requirements in order for an ecosystem to have the capacity to do that, to be conducive to human flourishing. So on the one hand, it's important that there is a delimitation of the ecosystem. It's got to be clear what it is we're talking about, where the boundaries are drawn. And those can be geographical boundaries, they can be conceptual boundaries in terms of what is AI, they can be technical boundaries in terms of what type of kit we're looking at. The ecosystem and its members collectively have to have a knowledge base. So very clearly that covers the technical side of things, so they have to understand the technology. But they also have to think of and be aware of and understand concepts and processes that have to do with things like stakeholder engagement, outreach, with reflective mechanisms in order to ensure that ethical concerns can be accommodated. And this knowledge base needs to also be updated. There needs to be a capacity to create, maintain, and keep current the knowledge base. And then finally, the third set of requirements has to do with ecosystems governance. So the ecosystem governance needs to be adaptive and flexible in order to accommodate for the complex relationship between members of the ecosystem. It has to be able to learn, and it has to be able to take a higher level view of responsibilities, something that we have called meta responsibility. So these three sets of recommendations we think can inform how current ecosystems, AI ecosystems, can be developed in a way that helps promote human flourishing. So the vision that we are formulating is to make sure that ethics is seen as an integral part of excellence in AI. So we argue that it's not good enough to see technical excellence or scientific excellence as separate from ethics, but ethics is actually part of it. If ethical concerns are not taken into consideration, then one cannot speak of technical excellence. And if that vision were to be realized, then we would be in a world where excellent AI and smart information systems support human flourishing by integrating ethical concerns and by safeguarding human rights. So that's what we are hoping for. That's the aim. That's our vision. And how would we get there? Well, we are suggesting that there are three different types of interventions that could be put forward. So these are our three main recommendations. And again, if you look at our websites, there's a recommendation tab there, and you'll see a lot more detail about those. So these three groups of recommendations correspond to the three requirements for ecosystems intervention that I've shown you earlier. So it's around delimitation, it's around governance, and it's around knowledge. So delimitation, we only came up with one in the end. So we said there's got to be conceptual clarity, i.e. what is it that we're talking about? What is AI? What type of technology is at the core of the debate? That needs to be clear in order for anything else to be relevant and specific. On the governance level, we are suggesting that there should be a regulatory framework, and the proposed regulation, I think, counts as an example of that. a regulatory framework that can incentivize and support human flourishing. We've suggested that there should be an AI agency, so a specifically created body that would look after and be the the source of or the gatekeeper of key knowledge in the area of ethics and AI. And we have suggested that on an organizational level, it would be useful to have a role with somebody with specific responsibility for ethical and human rights aspects, and we call that an AI ethics officer. And then in terms of the knowledge base, we are suggesting that there should be a baseline AI impact assessment. So there should be a mechanism whereby people can think in a structured way around what possible consequences of AI might be. We have developed, in collaboration with a sister project called Siena, a set of design guidelines, ethics by design for AI. We are still developing a training schedule, an education schedule around AI. We have contributed to standardization work, and we have also done work around security and come up with some specific technical recommendations of how particular types of threats can be addressed. Now, these are our main recommendations, but the important thing, and given that we're talking about a systems view here, is that they need to be looked at in conjunction. So they are actually related. So the delimitation, for example, provides the basis for the knowledge. You need to know what you're talking about in order to have the knowledge base. Similarly, growing knowledge can inform what exactly this, what exactly the delimitation would be. The governance structure can incentivize the creation and maintenance of knowledge, whereas the knowledge base needs to inform the governance structure. Similarly, governance needs to be specific to the AI system in practice. So there's sort of a relationship between those main groups, but there are also relationships between the individual recommendations. So, for example, a regulatory framework might well mandate an agency, or it might require the creation of an organizational role of AI ethics officer. Similarly, ethics by design would include probably an AI impact assessment. It would require people who undertake it to have some training and education, and it might draw on particular standards and particular security measures. And then finally, there's also there are relationships between the individual recommendations in the three groups. So an AI ethics officer, for example, would presumably require a certain amount of training. A regulatory framework might set the standards for an AI impact assessment, and so on. Oops. So that's our set of recommendations, and this is a different graphical representation of the same concepts. So this is what you see on our website if you look at the recommendation side. And you can see here that we've tried to make this accessible, and we've tried to provide an interesting starting point. And if you want to look at any of those recommendations in more detail, they're all available in more detail, including the SHERPA recommendations, but also cross links to other activities on our website in the recommendations section. So if you found any of this interesting and enlightening, then I would invite you to have a look at this book that I've just published. This is an open access book, so you can download it for free and read it on your Kindle or whichever way. Where we have taken the insights from the SHERPA project and tried to develop the narrative in more detail. And the argument that I've just given you in 34 minutes, you can read there on 50,000 words. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bernd. That was good insight into the ethical, the ethics. Yes, so the book, I sent you the link also. Everybody should have in the chat the link, so you can just click it, because it's difficult to click it in this presentation. And I will start, because I'm the moderator, and then I read your questions. Please send us your questions. We are waiting for them. So I start. Because basically we just have now these new regulations for AI. Did you contribute, and what would you like to highlight according to the recently published proposal for regulation on a European approach for artificial intelligence and the coordinated plan on AI by the Commission? I mean, have you participated in this somehow?
So the SHERPA project, while an EU project, wasn't part of DG Connect, where the regulation comes from. It was part of DG RTD, so Research and Development, as part of the Science with and for Society work. But we have, of course, had lots of interaction with the European Commission, and if you look at the recommendations, they are reasonably well aligned with the recommendation. So we did specifically reach out to the DG Connect, to some of the people involved in drafting the recommendation on several occasions. We also submitted our official feedback through the feedback mechanisms at the white paper stage. So we've had numerous interactions with the Commission. Overall, I think we can say we are reasonably happy with it. We think it's certainly a good start. It does really fulfill what we asked for, namely to have a regulatory framework. That's what this is supposed to do. I mean, there are still lots of open questions around it. So I would personally, for example, find it interesting and not terribly convincing that the risk-based approach that the Commission uses there only has 2 stages. You either are high risk or low risk, and there's nothing in between. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. No, there are open questions. I mean, they also propose an AI board, the European AI board, which goes in the direction of the agency that we've suggested, but it stops a long way before where we thought it was going. But again, I think what the Commission is doing here is it's trying to do something that's realistic, that actually can work, and we'll see how it works and then where it goes from here.
Yes, thank you. That was my question. And now a question from our audience member. His name is Job van Ormen. Why propose another EU agency and regulatory framework if the GDPR and thus the EDPB already covers large parts of this where data subjects are impacted? Why another?
Yeah, I think, well, the Commission asked the same question, and I think that there is a case that one could enlarge the remit of data protection regulatory agencies to cover AI. And we've actually, I mean, I'm based in the UK, and we've had the Information Commissioner's Office as a member of the ICO was a member of our stakeholder board, and we've actually asked them that at the very beginning of the project. Would you want to be the regulator for AI? And they were a bit torn. On the one hand, they said yes to some degree, but then we don't really have all the expertise that's required. And I think the argument for having a separate approach here, so not put everything under GDPR, is that a lot of the issues we're facing are not data protection issues. So privacy is a key concern with regards to AI, but is by far not the only one, and maybe not the most important one. Therefore, if there are to be ways of dealing with the issues coming out of AI, in particular the broader issues, the questions around justice distribution, political influence, and so on, if you try to narrow those down to data protection issues only, then I think we're missing a lot of the meat of the issue. And that's why I think it's justified to think a bit broader than data protection. But no, I fully grant you that broadening the remit of existing data protection regulators might also be a way of dealing with it.
Yes, yes, it's like the practical and the academic interest. Yes, Walter Quercioli, how do you feel the recent proposal for I think it's the same what I asked, for EU regulation satisfies your view about the relationship between ethics and AI?
Well, I mean, I can give a part of the answer here that didn't say to you, which is the question of ethics, which in the proposed regulation is a lot less prominent and visible than it was in the white paper, right? So we've had the high-level expert group and all of the work that came out of that, including the Altai guidelines and so on, where the concept of ethics was very prominent, whereas in the regulation, it's not. Yes. And I think that that's sort of an interesting question why that is. I would guess, well, I think that there are good reasons why you don't try to regulate ethics, because that's maybe not possible. And they have, so the European Commission in the proposed regulation have focused much more on fundamental rights, human rights, which I actually think makes a lot of sense. Because if you come to the point where you actually regulate, you have to regulate on a basis that's relatively uncontroversial. And of course, we have fundamental rights, whereas we don't have an agreed upon body of ethics that everybody would say, yeah, that's what's good and bad, or that's how we determine that. So in that sense, I think it's interesting to see the shift away from the concept of ethics while we're going towards the law.
Yeah, I agree. Yes, now comes another question. Bruna de Castro y Silva. Risk to human rights exists not only in public sector artificial intelligence-based AI. How to apply the horizontal direct effect to oblige private actors to protect human rights? Is the current discussion in the European Union on corporate social responsibility and mandatory human rights due diligence a possible framework?
Well, the short answer is maybe. So I think the question of the corporate influence or impact on human rights is, of course, core to this whole AI debate. And a lot of this is driven by the perception that, in particular, the big internet companies who own the data, who own the technology, who make the big progress in technical development, are the ones who benefit, who at the same time also are the ones who endanger or jeopardize human rights in various ways. So I think this analysis of the problem is probably fairly uncontroversial. The question is what to do about it. And I do think that an emphasis on implementing and enforcing human rights in organizations other than public sector organizations is certainly the way forward. Right? And there are, of course, there are lots of recommendations on how to do that. There is an OECD toolbox for human rights impact or human rights implementation in organizations. I think the question is, how can this be enforced, or how can this be promoted in a way that does not become hugely bureaucratically burdensome, while at the same time actually promoting this aim of protection of human rights. And that's, I think, where it becomes interesting. And that's why I'm slightly skeptical about CSR. I mean, we did, when we did our case studies, we also talked to people in organizations about where they see the AI issues that they encountered with regards to CSR. And as a general rule, there wasn't a strong recognition that this is the way to go. Now, CSR, but people in the tech development side of the organization don't tend to perceive CSR as something that's particularly relevant to them. I'm generalizing. I don't know. I haven't got strong empirical data to back this up, but that is my impression. And if that is true, then one would probably have to find other ways of implementing human rights. And I guess what the regulation is trying to do is just that. Through having this conformity assessment, they try to force organizations to think through possible human rights consequences at the beginning. Now, I think there are lots of methodological questions about how that is possible, whether that is possible. But I think it is an attempt to not go in the CSR direction, but to regulate directly.
Yes, yes, yes. I have another question. Claudia looks. Two aspects of human rights. First, is there a risk in AI that will endanger human rights? And second, will AI robots get human rights? Actual discussion. What is your view?
So the first question, if I got this right, was whether AI poses a risk to human rights.
Trying to understand it myself. The question, when I read it, is a little bit different. I think she wants your view about your view. That's the question. What is your view? And then it starts. Two aspects of human rights. One aspect, is there a risk in AI that will endanger human rights? Maybe that's also a question. Is there a risk in AI that will endanger human rights? And second, will AI robots get human rights?
Yeah. Okay, so the first one is relatively straightforward to answer. I think it's universally recognized that AI has the potential of creating risk for human rights, right? And biases and discrimination, I think, is the most widely discussed one. But if you're interested in the topic, there's a report by the AI Now Institute on Human Rights, which actually goes through this, and that's 3 years old, so it's not brand new. Which goes through this in a lot of detail, looks at all the various human rights and where AI may impact them, from the right to life, through warfare, through discrimination, through the right to work and gainful employment. And so there's a big literature on this. And the short answer is yes, absolutely. I think there's no doubt that these technologies they don't have to, but they can pose human rights risk. The second part of the question is, of course, a completely different kettle of fish. Now, will AI ever have rights themselves? Well, probably not human rights, but something equivalent. So if you think back of my categorization of concepts of AI and risks of AI, this is the bit on the left. This is the artificial general intelligence. And I think the question very nicely demonstrates why it's important to keep this on board, even though there are a lot of AI researchers who say, let's not talk about this. This is just not relevant. We don't have the technology. But it's clearly something that is on people's mind. And so I'd like to thank the audience member for asking the question. Now, do I have a good answer to that? Absolutely not. Right. I think at the moment, so for the moment, it's very easy. So at the moment, there is no piece of technology that has any reasonable claim to be in any way similar enough to humans to have similar rights. They're not truly autonomous. They don't understand the world. They have no context. They don't live. They don't die. They're just very different. Now, will that ever change? That's, I think, a very good question. And my personal suspicion is not with the technology we have at the moment, and probably not within my natural lifetime. So I'm not particularly worried about it, but I certainly cannot comprehensively argue that it can never happen. So with new types of technologies, with embodied agents that actually do grow up like us, that form social bonds, that have hang on to their lives and so on, maybe at some point they will be so similar that we as humans decide that they should have similar rights to ours. Now, is that possible? Yes, probably. I mean, science fiction is full of that. Is it likely to happen soon? No.
Yes, thank you. I'm very happy to say that there is no more question. You answered all these wonderful questions from the audience. It's a very nice café, because I don't like when there's so many questions and you have no time to do it. So I can ask the last one. As we are talking, for me, often very theoretical, and that's why maybe a practical. Do you have anything that you would like to say? This is a real nice, trustworthy, ethical, correct AI. Do you have any example we all understand what you think is good?
So that comes back to the my earlier categorization of AI. So I would find it very difficult to say that this is an AI, whereas this isn't. So what I've been trying to argue is that we should look at the socio-technical systems within which you find AI technologies. You also find other types of technologies, and that then create capabilities that can act on the world in a way that's either beneficial or not, right? Mm-hmm. And I think in that sense, you can certainly point to examples of beneficial AI which are outstanding, which are absolutely great. So, I mean, with a different hat on, not with my SHERPA coordinator hat on, but with my hat on as the ethics director of the Human Brain Project, I would point to the possible uses of AI for research purposes. Now, mm-hmm. As we all know, research produces more and more data. And the governance of that data and the analysis of that data is extremely complicated, but also potentially very promising in terms of the insights it can create. So the human brain is a good example of something that is immensely complicated, of which we understand bits, but certainly far away from everything. I would say this is an example of where AI has the potential to really make a positive difference, because there are data sets and there are ways of doing research on the brain that you can extend that to all sorts of other scientific subjects, where the traditional human mind and a piece of paper and a pencil are simply not enough. Now, we will never be able to work out what exactly the causal relationships are or what the correlations are if we don't use advanced technologies, including machine learning technologies. And I would say, if we are ever going to move in the direction of, for example, personalized medicine, where a doctor will take a drop of blood and then they will create your own drug which will cure your particular cancer, if that ever happens, then it's going to happen through advanced technologies. And I think the hope that that may happen, at least for some of us at some point, is probably sufficient to warrant further work in this direction.
Yes, that is basically my typical next question is then always, how can AI help to fight corona, fight cancer, prevent hunger, climate change? I mean, all these ideal things make the world better. And I think I totally agree that AI can support this research. No? I mean, towards going in the direction of. I have Ugo Sahin, who's the CEO from BioNTech, who's one of the corona vaccine inventor. I mean, he's a good example how he says without AI, he wouldn't have been so fast, no? To make a vaccine. And it just helped him to check out all the different possibilities super quick. And he's going as an example for that personalized cancer medicine. And so AI is a great tool to handle all this research data. And there might be, that's now another last question, and I'll let you go. I mean, my dream, it's a little bit like a John Lennon dream, but could you imagine that there would be one day a global AI research where they do it together instead of like country for country or continent against continent, who like really, I mean, do you think there could be examples on what could be globally researched together?
Well, I mean, that's of course absolutely not an AI question at all, right? That's a political question. And of course, I could imagine it. I could imagine world peace. We as humans have been able to imagine that for a long time. We haven't been able to get it anywhere. I do think, though, that there is a lot of attention on the international level that, in particular with regards to AI, and ethical aspects of it, we as humanity, we need to come together and agree on sort of minimum standards. And I think the European Commission at this point would argue that they're trying to set a standard and hope the rest will follow. And we'll see whether that's true. But there are also there's work on the OECD, the UNESCO has published proposals, the UN Secretary General has talked about the importance of getting this together. So there is a lot of international attention on this. Now, where would it go and how could it go? And I think that's actually a relatively easier question than many other questions, namely, what is it that on a global level we agree on is morally good and worth promoting? Well, we have the Sustainable Development Goals, right? So they, I think, have already gone a long way through international negotiations to an agreement of what humanity as a whole thinks are aims to worth pursuing. So I think if there are mechanisms to allow this global collaboration, then that's probably the primary target. Will it happen? Well, maybe to some degree. I mean, the Googles and the Facebooks of this world are already international to a large extent. Right? So maybe something, but they are of course not particularly benevolent. But maybe something comparable on an international level could emerge, or maybe it could come into being through international interventions from the UN or some other body like that. Yeah.
Yes. So I like your words, and that I'm going to end the cafe today on. And as many of you all know, also the audience, as I wrote it in the invitation, this is my summer break, starting right now. From in September, we will come back with the cafe. And I thank you very much, Bernd. As always, I will send you the recording. So for everybody, if Bernd allows afterwards, he checked the recording, then I will publish it and you can see it online, YouTube, and go to Stage, it's our AI4EU channel. And if you have further questions, we said it before in the beginning, maybe you write an email directly to Bernd Stahl. And also, that the last question is, would you share the presentation with people who ask you for it? Or
yeah, I'm happy to do that. Yeah.
Yeah. So if you want to have a presentation, please it's also a reason to write an email. So I wish you all a good day. Thank you for being here. This was very nice, and I hope you have a great summer. And see you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.